So let's get started. I am thrilled to introduce today's presenter, Deb Maui. She is a senior brand strategist here at mStoner. Deb started her marketing career in consumer packaged goods, brand management, working at Unilever and with brands like Suave and Axe. Prior to joining our team at mStoner, Deb worked for 7 years defining and managing the DePaul University brand, social media strategy, and strategic marketing efforts. During the session, you can tweet Deb at Deb Maui. You can tweet me at Mallory Wood, and don't forget to use the hashtag mStonerNow. Deb, I'm going to turn my webcam off and turn this session over to you. Let's get started.
Okay, thank you, Mallory. Hi, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day. I'm not wearing green, but I'm in a green room, so that's my tip of the hat to St. Patrick's Day. So I really appreciate everyone joining us today, and I'm excited to talk about brand strategy for the real world. So here's what we'll talk about today. We're going to talk about what is a brand. We'll talk about why branding is important in higher ed, and I know that you know it is, or you wouldn't be here, but also why it's so difficult, where the brand fits into everything else, the elements of a brand, the role of audience research and how you do it, how you develop a message map to translate your brand to key audiences and make it relevant for the real world. And we'll talk about some of the most common frustrations with brand development and some strategies you can use to overcome those frustrations. So first of all, what is a brand? It's an interesting question because I think if you ask 10 different people for the definition of a brand, you'd probably get 10 different answers. But at mStoner, we define a brand as what you stand for in the minds of the people you're trying to reach, influence, and move to action. And the important thing here, I think, is that it's all about moving people to action. Because while it's nice to have a very eloquent brand positioning, if it's not actually getting people to do the things that you want them to do, like enroll or donate money or support you in the legislature, then it's not really working as hard for you as it should be, and everyone's wasting a lot of time and money. So this is how we define a brand at mStoner. And if that's the definition of a brand, then brand strategy is the art and science of discovering, understanding, articulating, and evolving your brand, because a brand is not something that is static. Whether you're actively doing something to define your brand or not, it's always evolving based on the programs, the services, the things that you're doing in the community, and all those touch points that you have with people. So as I said, I know that you wouldn't be here today if you didn't think that brand strategy was important. But if we were sitting here 10 years ago, there would be a lot of people in higher ed who would still have questions about whether brand strategy really makes sense for higher ed, whether it's really important, whether it really translates from industries like consumer packaged goods into higher ed. So higher ed's really come a long way in the last 10 years, and there's a long list of reasons why brand strategy is important. And first and foremost, it helps attract best fit students. So not only more students, although you hope that it's also doing that, but also students who are likely to be a good fit for your institution. You're helping the right students find you up front. Creates differentiation from competition. Let's face it, there are a lot of higher ed institutions out there, and there's a limited number of words in the English language that we all use to describe them. And so it's important to create a meaningful and differentiated and unique brand positioning that really sets you apart from your competition. We'll talk more about competition later. Third, it helps support a strong tuition price, or the right tuition price for your institution. It provides immediate credibility for new offerings, schools, and programs. Engages and leverages alumni for affinity and also for fundraising. And then finally, it helps attract and retain the best employees and faculty. So if brand strategy is important, it's also difficult, and higher ed presents some unique challenges, I think, for brand strategy. And you know, and if you ask a brand manager in any industry, they're going to tell you that branding in their industry, in their category, is really difficult. So everyone thinks it's hard, but there are some unique things about higher ed that make it particularly difficult, I believe. First of all, we're talking to many different audiences, and those audiences want different things from the institution. So prospective students want different things from alumni, and even prospective parents want different things from prospective students. Faculty and staff want different things. Legislative audiences want different things, and hiring managers want different things. So everybody's looking at your institution in different ways, and so the messaging has to be different to them to appeal to them, but it all has to roll up to an overarching brand message that's consistent. Secondly, there are many internal stakeholders who want to have a say in the brand. In consumer packaged goods, the brand manager says this is what the brand's going to be, and that's it. But in a higher ed institution, there are lots of stakeholders who have a vested interest, and they care about the brand, and they want to have a say. So just the process of brand strategy is complicated. Third, you're not starting from scratch. Unless you're a brand new higher ed institution, which most people are not from an institution like that, you already have a brand out there. And it's based on all of the things that your institution's been doing up until now. So it's important to understand where you are right now, because you're not just saying, well, here's our brand, and no one's ever seen it before. Fourth, the mission can be very different from the brand. This depends on the institution, but if you have an institution, say, that was founded on an access mission, that's not necessarily a message that plays well to prospective students, or at least all prospective students. So there's a disconnect there that has to be managed. And then finally, related to the many internal stakeholders, marketing doesn't usually run the show. So marketing isn't the final decision maker on what the brand is going to be and how it's going to be implemented. So kind of a long list there of why we can get so frustrated when we're trying to do brand strategy in a higher ed institution. So yes, this guy's been dealing with this for a while, and he's very frustrated. And he's also wondering where brand strategy fits in with everything else that he's doing as a higher ed marketer. Because again, all these terms get thrown around, like brand and logo and messaging, and where does everything fit together? Well, this shows you how it all fits together, or how we believe it all fits together. So there are three elements that go into defining the brand or inform the brand. And then there are four things that come out of the brand once it's defined. So the three things that go into defining the brand are, first of all, audience research. So an understanding of how your audiences perceive you today and what they want from you. The mission, as we said before, which says this is why we're in business, this is why we were founded, and this is what we intend to do as an institution. And then third, that competitive understanding, because you don't want to end up with a beautiful brand positioning statement that's right on top of one of your competitors. So those are the three elements that really inform the brand and help whatever leadership team is coming to agreement on what that new brand strategy is going to be. And then coming out of that brand positioning are four elements. First of all, the strategic plan. And I'm not talking about the strategic marketing plan, I'm talking about the institutional strategic plan. And I will say right now that not all institutions are there in terms of the brand informing the actual strategic plan of the institution, but for very forward-thinking colleges and universities, the brand is really the foundation of the strategic plan, because the brand says, this is our promise that we're making to the world, and the strategic plan defines how the institution is going to deliver on that. The second thing is the visual design, or the how it looks, and a lot of times when people talk about brands, this is what they mean. They're talking about the logo, they're talking about the colors, the way the brand gets expressed visually. And this is a very important outcome of the brand, but it's not the brand itself. But it is one of the outward expressions of the brand to all of your audiences, internal and external. Third thing is the creative platform. That's what you say about your brand to all of those audiences. So that's the campaign, the theme, the creative idea that comes out of the brand. This is different from the brand because it's external. The brand is an internal document. And then fourth is the marketing plan. So this is, once you've just decided what you're going to say, the marketing plan says, here's where we're going to say it. We're going to use billboards. We're going to use our website in this way. We're going to use ViewBook. So it defines what all of those tactics are and how they're going to be used. Just as there are many ways to define a brand, there are different ways to define the brand elements, and there's really no right or wrong way. Different people call these different things, but this is the way we define them at mStoner. There are four elements that make up the brand. There's the brand essence, the brand's positioning, the brand attributes, and the elevator points. So first we're going to talk about the brand essence. In many ways it's the most difficult to understand, and it's really the most difficult to develop because it needs to be so simple. But it's really the glue that holds everything together. It's the core of the experience. It's the core of the promise that you're making to all of your audiences. So we'll go through a couple of examples to show you what I mean by the brand essence. And for most of these, I have to say this is my interpretation of what the brand essence is, because I'm not privy to their internal documents. So, but this is what I believe their brand essences are. So Disney, first of all, Disney says essence is magic. They're looking to provide a magical experience through all of their businesses. And so this is the filter that everything needs to go through. Is what we're doing magical? Does it fulfill our brand promise, our brand essence of magic? Next one is Nike, which is performance for every athlete. And now a couple from higher ed, and I'm not going to tell you what institutions they're from. But first one, urban, educated, world ready. This one sounds a bit more like a tagline. Sometimes essences are a little tagliney, but they really are meant to be internal representations, not taglines to external audiences. And then a very simple one. This was for a K-12 school, independent school that we worked with. Their essence was known, because it's about knowing and understanding each individual student, how they learn, what their personalities are. So two educational examples of brand essence. Next is the brand positioning. And the brand positioning is the promise that you're making to all of your audiences about what you will be. It should be aspirational, but grounded in the reality of where you are today. So the reality of how people are talking about your college or university today. It should feel like a better version of what we are. Sometimes I've presented brand positioning statements to clients, and they say, "Oh, I just got chills," because it sounds like what we are. It sounds like kind of like what we are today, but it really sounds like what we want to be in the future. So here's these examples that I'm going to show you of brand positioning are from education. This is a different K-12 school than the one I showed you before. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can read it. I'll just read the introductory paragraph. We are a warm, welcoming community committed to the success of each individual student. We give each student an individualized educational experience focused on exceptional academics, character development, and service to others. So as you can see, this is not something you'd put in an ad. It's not something you'd put on your website, because it's not consumer language, but it helps the internal audiences understand the promise that you are making to your external audiences. And then the rest of it goes on to explain in more detail what that first paragraph means. Here's another one. This is for a graduate school of education. We are shaping the future of education by cultivating educational leaders and innovators focusing research on the important questions and broadly communicating knowledge. And again, then the rest of it goes on to explain that in more detail. So very different type of institution here. We like to put the brand positioning in we language, again, because it's meant for the internal community to really get behind. Next is the brand attributes. And these are the main pillars or themes that make up that brand positioning statement. We're going to talk about how you make your brand relevant for different audiences, but these attributes don't differ by audience. These are the attributes that make up your overall brand, and they're the same for all of your audiences. So each attribute should include maybe a 1 to 3 word attribute name, not complicated, plus 2 to 3 descriptors to explain it. As I said before, in higher ed, there are a lot of institutions. We're dealing with a limited number of words in the English language. So when you see a list of these attributes, not each one is going to be unique. For instance, you almost always see something about educational excellence, which is not going to be ownable by any institution. But that's one of those price of entry things in the category that most institutions need to be saying in some way. So it's really the combination of these brand attributes that tells a unique story about your college or university, and also those descriptors underneath that really explain what you mean by each one. So let me show you an example. This is one of those K-12 independent schools that I showed you before, and they have 6 brand attributes, and they are joyful community, academic rigor, search for truth, building a meaningful life, prepared for success, and developing confidence. And then I'll show you those first 2, what the descriptors look like underneath them. So what they mean by joyful community is nurturing and supportive, encouraging risk-taking, defend your point of view, developing confidence, is welcoming to all, family-oriented, and collaborative. So again, most K-12 schools would probably say they develop confidence, but it's the way they deliver on it and what they mean by it, and then the combination of all of those attributes that make it unique. The brand attributes are basically kind of a stripped down version of that brand positioning statement that I showed you before. And then finally, the elevator points. We provide all of our clients with elevator points as part of the brand strategy. And we do it because when we interview clients, and specifically we talk to alumni and current students and faculty and staff, they often say, people ask me about this place all the time. And so I have opportunities to really talk it up, but I'm really not sure what you want me to say. Tell me what you want me to say. So this arms them with that language that they can use for those 30-second conversations that they have in a very natural kind of way. Not meant to be verbatim, not meant to be memorized, but sort of the gist of the conversation that we want them to have with people. So the blank experience isn't one size fits all. We know each student and can tailor it to the talents, abilities, and passions of the individual. Our students develop strong roots, becoming mature and independent while also getting the level of support they need. So people can use 1, 2, 3, 4 of these points in conversation, depending on how much time they have. But it just gives them very natural language to talk about the brand. So those are the 4 brand elements.
And Deb, we have some questions if you don't mind taking a few.
No, shoot. I love questions.
All right, great. Well, Julie's wondering if you would add fundraising plan as one of the brand outputs.
That is an excellent question. Yes. So when we talk about, I was using sort of, let me go back to that. I was using sort of generic terms here. And so when we say marketing plan, it can be a marketing plan for the whole institution. It can be a marketing plan for enrollment. It could be a marketing plan for fundraising. So any of the marketing plans or create, there could be a number of marketing plans and actually a number of creative platforms depending on the institution, because you may have a different capital campaign platform than you do a prospective student campaign. So you could have multiple creative platforms and multiple marketing plans coming out of this. Hopefully you don't have multiple visual designs for the overall brand, but yeah, there are definitely more than one plan that can come out of this. Great question.
And yeah, and Anne's noting that you said that the brand informs the strategic plan. So if an institution wants to refine the brand, do you recommend that the discovery phase occur before the general college strategic plan is formed?
Yes, and as I said up front, not all institutions are doing this. Not all institutions are tying the brand and the strategic plan, but we're seeing that more and more institutions are. So what we recommend is that the brand work, the brand strategy work, happen before the start of a new strategic planning process, so that the brand promise can be the start of the strategic plan. The brand promise says, okay, here's the promise that we're making. Now, what are the things that we need to do, what the strategies and the tactics to deliver on that?
Excellent. And then last question for now. Melissa's wondering if a stakeholder like the Alumni Relations Office, for example, can have their own brand strategy, or can it only be part of the larger institution? So, she's saying, what if you don't have the buy-in from some of your key decision makers, like the cabinet, the president, or some administrators? Is it a worthwhile exercise for an individual office to go through, or does it really need to be part of the larger institution?
Ideally, it would be part of the larger institution. But if the larger institution doesn't have the interest or the will or the funds or to do a full brand strategy project for the institution, I would say absolutely it's still good to do brand work for a specific office, because what often happens is that other divisions see that work and they see the power of it. They see the power particularly of that market research, and it helps to get them on board, and it can form a starting point for that larger conversation. The trick obviously then is to end up in a place where everything all fits together, and so you're not developing a brand here and a brand there, because that's really a recipe for disaster, because you're not going to have a cohesive message at the end. But I have seen it happen that way, and I would say if there's nothing happening in the central office or with the leadership, then absolutely it makes sense to do it yourself.
Got it. All right.
Great question.
We just got
Thank you.
One more.
Okay.
John is wondering if you can just touch on competitive understanding again. And then after you answer that, you can keep rolling with the rest of your session.
Yeah, so I didn't say a whole lot about competitive understanding. I'm going to talk about it a bit more when I talk about audience research. But there are several ways that we gather competitive information as part of a brand strategy project. And in the discovery phase up front, that's where we do the first part. And that's where we're looking at the websites of competitors. We're looking at all of their materials. We're Googling them and seeing what's being said about them in the news. So we're getting that general understanding. And then, so that's the first place that we look at competitors. And then we also look at competitors as part of the research. So when we're doing research with the different audiences to inform the brand, we ask not only about the institution we're working with, but we ask questions about perceptions and experiences and understanding of that competitive set as well. I was going to talk about at the end about the challenge of defining a competitive set, but I'll talk about it for a minute now because it is really important. It's one of the biggest challenges of a brand strategy project is defining who your competitors are. And it's a challenge for any institution. It's really a challenge for big institutions that have graduate programs and undergraduate programs, because the list of competitors can be different, even for different graduate programs. But what we recommend is a list of 3 to 4 major competitors. and they include the institutions that are your closest actual competitors, not only in numbers, but actually in type of institution as well. And then several, 1 to 2 sort of aspirational brands, institutions in your geographic area. So I'll tell you, when I was at DePaul, our competitive set that we almost always looked at was Loyola, the University of Illinois, and Marquette. Now, the University of Illinois was tricky because it's not very much like DePaul, but because it is the flagship brand institution in Illinois, it's just everybody's major competitor, so you really can't ignore it. Loyola was the institution we were most like, and then Marquette was the institution that we wanted to be, we really wanted to be like, which was a step up from the DePaul, perceptions of the DePaul brand. So it's a really challenging exercise to define that competitive set, but that's what we usually recommend. I hope that answered the question.
I think so.
Okay.
Onward.
Okay, good. Now I don't have to talk about that at the very end. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about market research and using market research to inform the brand. We'll talk about why it's important, when it's used, who you should talk to, and then the types of research that you can do. I can't say enough about how important market research is as part of this process because it helps you understand the perspective of the audiences who matter, which are the people who are going to be enrolling and the people who are going to be giving money and the people who are going to be influencing those people who are enrolling. That's not to say that the opinion of your president isn't important, or the opinion of your head of advancement. Those are important too, but the external audiences are really the ones that you're trying to influence, so they're the ones that you really need to understand. The other reason that research is important is it gives you credibility for your recommendations. It's way more difficult to argue with research than with opinions, even if that research is qualitative, even if you're showing people quotes from current students, from alumni, from prospective students. It's really powerful and very hard to argue with when you're talking about differences in opinion internally and externally about what the brand is. This is another key challenge, probably one of the biggest challenges that we face when doing a brand strategy project, is who should you talk to? And it really depends on the institution and what the goals are of the research and the brand project, but it usually makes sense, it always makes sense to talk to prospective students. And if you have a large graduate population, both undergrad and grad, current students, parents, prospective students, or prospective parents or current parents, guidance counselors, alumni. So those are the audiences that we talk to most often, probably maybe with the exception of guidance counselors. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Again, depends on the goals. But this is kind of the going in starter list that we assume that we're going to be talking to. Sometimes institutions come to us with a list of audiences that they want to talk to. It often includes other higher ed leaders, hiring managers, civic and government leaders, and major donors. So often we put them in the mix as well. Although these people, not major donors, but the other people can be very difficult to reach because they don't really necessarily have a vested interest in talking to you about your brand. So a short comment about who you shouldn't talk to, and that is everyone. Sometimes we hear people say, well, we want to know what everyone thinks. We want to know what the general population thinks about our brand. Well, the general population, first of all, isn't an audience. It's a combination of a whole lot of different audiences. And second of all, most of the general population isn't in the higher ed market at any given point in time. So your average Joe on the street isn't looking to go to school or influencing anyone who's looking to go to school. So it's there, while from kind of a vanity standpoint, it's nice to think that everyone thinks really highly of your institution. It's just not meaningful. It's way too expensive to get outside of those key audiences, except in a few circumstances, again, depending on what the goals of the project are. First, we're going to talk about qualitative research. We'll talk about qualitative and quantitative, but I want to start with qualitative. Excuse me. So we always recommend starting with qualitative research when we're doing a brand strategy project, even if we're going to do quantitative research after that. Qualitative research answers those why questions. So if you give people a list of attributes and ask them to pick the ones that they would associate with your school, someone's invariably going to ask the question, well, why did they answer the question that way? What did they mean by that? When they said strong academic reputation, what did they mean? So qualitative research answers the why question. It tells you what they meant by their answer. It also provides really good input for quantitative research because it helps you make sure you're asking questions in the right way and phrasing them in a way that makes sense for your school. It's also very flexible. You know, you can dig deeper, you can go here, you can go there, you can push, you can pull. It's really a conversation. So it's a lot more flexible than quantitative. There are many types of qualitative research, but usually we do a combination of focus groups and one-on-ones. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but you can do focus groups in person or online very effectively, and we usually do a combination of both depending on where people are. And then we almost always supplement with one-on-ones. One-on-ones not only can be used for sensitive topics, but often somebody important can't make it to a focus group, so doing a one-on-one interview as a follow-up is a good option for that. You don't want to do all one-on-ones because it's really expensive. It's really time-consuming. So for as great as qualitative research is, it does have some limits. First of all, your budget and sort of practical realities usually dictate that you're talking to your own people. The challenge when you're doing qualitative research is that you want to talk to people who know something about your institution. And so the people who are likely to know something about your institution are people who are engaged with it in some way. Either they're in your prospect pool, they're alumni. So again, we're not talking about usually going out to the general public. So you have to recognize that it's not going to be a representative sample. Secondly, you have to make sure that you're asking questions about opinions and past behavior. People are really bad at predicting their own future behavior, or anyone else's future behavior, I guess. But if you ask someone, if we offered this course, would you take it? They're going to give you an answer, but it's not going to mean anything because they can't predict their own behavior. Relatedly, if you ask a question, you'll get an answer. But it's not necessarily reliable. People like to make the moderator happy. So if you ask them a question about their opinion of some small school they've never heard of, they may pretend that they have heard of it, but so you have to be careful about the questions that you ask. And then it's also usually limited to people with high affinity unless you provide incentives. We almost always recommend providing incentives, but sometimes those incentives have to get really large, like other higher ed leaders. You have to pay them a lot of money to talk to you. Quantitative research is the other way to do research. It can be a very helpful tool at several points. First of all, when you use it after qualitative, it can make sure that you have your brand attributes right, so it can confirm what you learned in qualitative. If you end up with multiple options for positioning statements, you can use quantitative to pick a winner. And it can also be used to track changes in brand awareness and perceptions over time. So if you want to know how you're doing, you can do a quantitative test every couple of years and see changes in your brand perceptions. To do quantitative and really do quantitative research, you need at least 50 to 100 respondents per group. Other than that, you're just doing an online or a survey type of qualitative research. And again, it's important to do that qualitative first so that you're able to answer the why questions that come up in the quantitative. Then I'm going to get right into how to make the brand relevant for your audiences. So having a strong institutional brand is really important. Make sure that you're going out there with a cohesive, consistent message. But as we know, one size does not fit all, because an institutional brand usually doesn't get at the individual needs of specific audiences. So as I said up front, one of the challenges is that we're trying to talk to lots of different audiences who have different perceptions, different needs. And so, and one institutional brand can't speak to each audience in a compelling way. People engage, they enroll, they donate based on the benefits that they get, and those are different for different audiences. So we use what's called a message map to translate the brand into meaningful benefits for each audience. And so it includes the brand attributes, which are common across all of the audiences, and then audience-specific key benefits. And so this can be a really helpful tool for all communicators, so people who are developing messaging for individual audiences. We actually hand out copies, and people keep it at their desk as a reference for what they should be communicating to their audiences. So this is an example of a message map. There's a lot of detail on here, but along the top you see the attributes, and those are the attributes that are common across the brand. And then the definitions, you see the definitions underneath. So you see what we mean by academic excellence, what we mean by individualized experience. The brand essence is in the middle. And then at the bottom is where we translate those attributes into the audience-specific benefits. And in this case, this is a prospective parent message map for a K-12 school. And so the benefits are lifelong connections, entrances into best fit colleges, belonging, and successful graduates, because those are the things that are important to prospective parents in the choice of a K-12 independent school. And then there are descriptors that come under those benefits as well. For the same school, this is the message map for alumni. So you see the same attributes across the top, but then different benefits along the bottom: connected to community, personal success, respected by others, and wise investment, and the descriptors underneath them as well. So they're not wildly different from the prior map. There are a lot of similarities, but those benefits at the bottom really speak to that audience. Next example is from a law school. This project is still ongoing, but this is a slightly different way to do message maps, and this developed message maps for different prospective student personas. So even with prospective students, sometimes you need to talk to different audiences or different personas in slightly different ways in terms of the benefits that you're emphasizing. So you can see here's a message map for academic superstar. Again, attributes all the same at the top, but different benefits along the bottom depending on the persona. Same school. This is a career changer persona, prospective student persona. Things that were important to them were ability to start immediately and having a flexible schedule in addition to those career opportunities and preparation. And then another persona was a family provider, and so slightly different benefits that persona was interested in. So it's a very flexible tool, but it really gets into the very specific messaging that is important for each audience and translates that overall brand for the audience. Developing a message map is not complicated. It also involves market research, and that market research can be done concurrently with the research that informs the total brand. It just involves asking slightly different questions or some additional questions. In this case, the market research that you're doing to develop a message map involves understanding not only the audience perceptions of your institution and competitors, but understanding just what your audience wants in general from an educational institution. So it's more about the category and not just your institution. So what are the factors that are important? You can do this in two ways. You can do it qualitatively. You can also do it quantitatively with an attribute study where you give people a list of attributes that may be important to them, and you ask them to rate those attributes on importance, and then you also ask them to rate your institution and competitive institutions on those same attributes. And here's a list of some sample attributes that that you can use and that prospective students or parents may use to evaluate an institution. And where you end up with this is an eye chart, and I apologize for that, but you end up with a nice map that shows you the importance versus your school's performance on each of those attributes, and you can assign each of those attributes to a quadrant. So in the upper left are the opportunity areas for your institution. So these are the things that are really important to people, but that you didn't score as well on. So they're the things that you really need to talk up because they're really important to people. In the bottom right are the things that you've performed really well on, but weren't as important. So those are important things to emphasize because they're associated with your brand, but you have to talk about why they're important to people. So you got to elevate that importance. And then in the upper right is really the sweet spot, and those are the things that are important and that you own, and those are things that can really differentiate your institution. So this can be a helpful tool to inform that map. So the way you create the message map is that you take all of that research from qualitative and or quantitative and identify the top benefits that your audience wants and that your institution also delivers. Group those benefits into broader themes, and then those become the audience specific benefits. There's some art and some science in it, but the important thing is that those benefits at the bottom be very specific to the benefits that each audience is looking for.
Hey Deb, do you mind if I ask you a couple lingering questions back from your section on market research?
Sure.
Super. So first of all, when you're doing qualitative research, how many focus groups or interviews do you think you should do?
Well, the consultant answer, it all depends. When we're doing focus groups, we always do at least 2 focus groups per audience. Sometimes you can have a real outlier or a couple outliers in a group. So if you're talking to alumni, if you have a person who's kind of an outlier and also very vocal, they can skew the group. So it's important to have another group, a separate group to confirm or deny what the other group was saying. So when doing groups, we do in-person groups, we do 2 groups per audience at least. If you're doing one-on-one interviews, you usually need I would say 8 to 10 per audience to really get a good picture of that audience.
Okay, and then kind of follow up. Morgan's wondering, how do you typically go about getting participants or segmenting your audiences? And do you put out a blanket email and select respondents from there, or what kind of research do you have to do prior to picking?
Usually we determine the parameters. So we work with the institution to decide, do we want to talk to just freshmen, or do we want to talk to a cross section? And so define the parameters, and then they get a list, and then start emailing. Usually start by emailing a large group, and then what works really well is that when people start to respond and say that they're interested, you send them a list of a few questions just to make sure that they're able to give you complete, thoughtful, articulate answers in a focus group setting. So usually it's a 2-step process for recruiting.
Okay.
And we almost always offer incentives.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's good to know. How much, I'm curious, how much, on average would you say those incentives would cost?
I would say the average is usually about $75. For prospective students, it can be $75 to $100. For current students, it can usually be less than that. It can be 25 to 50. So it depends on the audience. We rarely have to pay people more than 100, unless it's one of those really difficult to reach audiences. Okay, thanks, Valerie. Good questions. So I just want to talk a little bit about the most common frustrations and give you some tools and tricks to deal with them. So I already talked about competitive sets. I'm not going to talk about that more unless you have specific questions, but I want to talk about how you define the team that works on a brand strategy project, managing the scope, managing the grumblers, and implementing the brand across campus. So first of all, defining the team. Usually we work with two different teams when we're doing a brand strategy project. So there's a core team of maybe 3 people who are the point people. They're doing the recruiting. They're making the day-to-day decisions about research, about questionnaires, kind of the nitty-gritty of the project. And then there's a larger leadership team that can be 12 to 15 people. And that larger leadership team usually meets at several points in the process to discuss research, to agree to the brand, to talk about how the brand's going to be implemented. And it can be tricky to know who should be on that team, but it really needs to be anyone in the senior leadership whose buy-in is important to ultimately being able to implement the brand. So it often includes the head of enrollment, the head of advancement, sometimes the president, often someone from the board of trustees, often students. There's a student participant, a faculty participant. So it depends on the institution what that right team is, but it is important to make sure that you have a strong leadership team that is supporting the brand strategy project, because it's really critical that they be supportive of it in order for it to be implemented. I talked about competitive set already, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore. I'm sure no one has ever dealt with the scope creep in their higher ed institution. It's very rare. But managing scope, just like any project in a higher ed institution, can be one of the most difficult challenges. And the biggest place we see scope becoming an issue is with defining the market research and what audiences we're going to talk to. Because often that leadership team has very specific ideas about groups that they want to talk to, and often the budget doesn't allow for us to talk to all of those groups. So really the keys to managing the scope are being very clear about the objectives and the plan up front when first convening that leadership team. And secondly, helping the leadership team understand what their role is in the process. So helping them understand where their input is really important and at what points their input is going to be asked for, and where they're going to have an opportunity to voice an opinion. And if it's clear that they're not part of the decision-making process about market research and specifically what audiences to talk to, that can help to minimize those scope issues when the leadership team gets involved. Managing the grumblers. This guy's writing a blog post about how much he hates your new brand. So we know, we've all seen it happen. We've seen the nasty blog posts from an alum, from the students with signs picketing the new brand. And you know, the fact is that no one's ever, I mean, you're never going to make everyone completely happy with a new brand definition. So there are a couple of ways to manage the grumblers. Getting participation in market research from those groups who tend to grumble is very important. So the current students and the alumni, so that their voice can be heard. Sometimes it's helpful to have, as I said, to have an alum or a student on that leadership team, that sponsor team. You can also, as budget and time allows, get feedback on the proposed brand from these audiences before it's finalized. Sometimes that's important, sometimes it's not important. but ultimately, you have to know that you're never going to make everyone happy, and that the grumblers will probably eventually move on to something else as they get bored, and have something else to grumble about. But and you have to kind of have a thick skin as well. But if you're doing the research to inform the brand and you know that you're in the right place, it gives you strong ammunition to manage the grumblers. And then finally, implementation, because it's great to have this really beautiful brand strategy, this beautiful brand framework, but it's all about how it gets implemented. Implementing the brand takes a really long time because you're trying to change the language of the institution internally and externally. So it does require a lot of patience. It requires prioritizing audiences and prioritizing vehicles. If the art museum is not on board with implementing the brand, it's not as important as if the enrollment management group isn't. So you have to prioritize the audiences and do the important ones first, and then kind of pick your battles and decide which ones you want to fight to get them on board. But in any case, it takes a long time and lots of internal training of communicators, lots of time spent on rollout, and just a big glass of patience. And this is just a recap of some things I already said. So that's it. Happy to take more questions, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things. First of all, we think a lot about brand strategy and how to jumpstart it, and so we put together 3 articles that may help your thinking about how to start a brand strategy project. Those are here, and we'd love to talk to you and help you understand more about the effectiveness of your brand. And so we have a brand grader that we've developed that we would love to use to assess your brand. To do that, we need some information from you. So if you go to that link, you'll see the information that we need from you in order to be able to grade the brand. But we would love to talk to you about that.
Super. And as we're going through Q&A, I will make sure that I share those links through the chat feature and on Twitter. I just sent out that March webinar link, and I'll get the brand grader out there as well. Deb, we do have a couple more questions. Before I ask, I do want to make sure everybody knows that there will be a very short exit survey when you log out of the webinar. It's optional, but it really helps us know if you enjoyed today's session, how Deb did, and it gives us ideas for future webinar topics, which we've already been getting some suggestions from our attendees on things that they would love to see later this year. So definitely fill that out if you have some ideas, and we read them all, and we'll look forward to checking that out. We also have had a very active back channel. Deb, you'll have some fun tweets to go through after this wraps up. I will say my very favorite tweet is from Andrea, who works at Concordia. She said, "Perhaps the phrase, 'that's outside the scope' is the key to brand success." I love that.
Andrea, I'm gonna steal that.
Yeah.
And use that.
It was great, right?
Just keep saying it over and over and over again.
Exactly. All right. So I have a question from Kristen, who's wondering, she would love some suggestions on how to overcome pushback from administrators that are looking to outsource everything. And she's noting that in-house, she would like to maintain some of the marketing functions and act as an in-house agency for the university.
That's an excellent question. I think it is about establishing credibility in those areas, and making the leadership comfortable that that internally the internal product will be as effective as an external product. So things like sending the leadership articles that you've found on the topic to show that you're looking externally, you're up on the latest topics and understanding. Helping them understand that you have a thorough plan for brand strategy or any other type of creative that you want to do. That you've got you're approaching it in a very strategic, prioritized kind of way that will in the end be a better way to utilize resources.
Next question, should you test your brand positioning with students, alumni, and so on before launching the brand, or should it just be the decision of the leadership team?
Well, I think it all depends. It adds time and money to the process to test it internally. So there's no right answer. I've done it both ways. The downside of inviting them into the conversation is that it can give the impression that if they don't like it, you're not going to do it. But on the other hand, if you don't test it, then it can give them more ammunition to come back and grumble later. But if I had a choice, I would include them very heavily in the research plan up front, but not test the brand positioning before launch. Make it clear that it's the decision of the leadership.
Sure. And then we actually had a question from someone who's at South by Southwest and not even attending today's webinar, but has been paying attention to the back channel and wondering, well, noting that most university brand strategies often only achieve sameness. Are there any good examples of true differentiation? And Deb, I'll say I'll give you a hall pass on this one. If you want to think about that, we can include the answer in our wrap-up blog post on the blog later this week. But if you have some ideas off the top of your head, I'd love to hear them right
now. Well, I mean, I always have to give hats off to American University because I think that when they launched their brand, gosh, it's 5 or 6 or 7 years ago now, it was really a great example of a brand that was based on a very solid research plan and very solid understanding of who their students were and who their students weren't. And it allowed them to create a very differentiated positioning in the market that said, this is what we are. And if this isn't what you are, then perhaps another school would be better. Obviously not in so many words, but there's a lot of sameness because institutions are uncomfortable putting a stake in the ground and saying this is what we are, and by definition saying this is what we're not. And so schools that are willing to make a bold move are the ones that are differentiated, and I think American is a good example of that.